Thank you so much for staying with us. The West African sub-region is a focal point of old and new forms of armed conflict, violent extremism, organized crime, piracy, unrest due to social inequality, land use conflicts, election-related offenses, you name it. But in recent time, the Sahel region in West Africa particularly has been plagued by recurring military coups and political instability. I saw a map. I don't know how many of you saw that map. It will seem like the belt right above Nigeria, all the countries are now being led by, have gone through one military coup or the other. And this has posed significant challenges to regional development and democratic governance. So in response to this alarming trend, ECOWAS has emerged as a key actor in the battle against military coups in the Sahel. This issue is so concerning that, of course, we all know that the president, along with other, in his capacity as chairman of ECOWAS, along with other leaders in the region, have been calling for one intervention or the other. What is important is to maintain peace in the ECOWAS region. So the one key factor that member states have mechanized for settling disputes peacefully is what has already been instituted. Liberia and Sierra Leone's wars threatened to engulf other countries in the region, and ECOWAS used some settlement mechanisms, such as military troops and all, to supervise ceasefire brokered by the then Ghanaian President, Jerry Rawlings. Let's have conversations this morning with Dr. Adeoye Akinola, who is Head Research and Teaching and Head of Unit African Union Studies, Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in South Africa. He joins us this morning along with Oyewole Ogini, who is a researcher and analyst, Armed Conflicts, Peace and Security Africa, Bonn International Conflict Center in Germany. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Truly appreciate your time. Let me begin with you, Dr. Akinola. Yesterday when we, it was earlier this week when we started conversations around this, one of the questions we were asking is whether, our guest at the time thought that this whole unrest in Niger was coming as a surprise. To you, Dr. Akinola, does it come to you as a surprise?
Well, thank you so much, and good morning in Nigeria from Johannesburg. Frankly, without actually mincing words, it is not a surprise. The only surprise is that it's even been delayed. It's coming at a particular point in time where the entire Sahel region have been overridden by one conflict or the other. Students and policy analysts and researchers on security conflict will tell you the spillover effect of one conflict spilling to another country or another region. Once we have those waves of coup in the Sahel from one country to another, we know and we have been raising alarms that there's every possibility that the neighboring countries will soon be overrun by different kinds of military coups. And that's why the one in Niger is not a surprise. It should have even come earlier. That's what is surprising. And other sub-regional countries in that western part of Sahel should also be worried. Even if they still have a civilian government in power, they shouldn't sleep with their eyes closed, because at any point in time, the military may seize power.
Well, Mr. Ogini, how about you? Yeah. Did you expect that this was going to happen? There are those who are wondering, this wasn't supposed to happen, at least not at the level. Do you agree with Dr. Akinola?
I agree to some extent, but maybe a little addition to what he said, because You know, Niger is a very strategic country in Sahel, which most international actors have been supporting. For instance, the United States military bases there. France has been up and doing. Germany is providing military support and democratic building in the past year. So I foresee that this could have strengthened the institution and reduced this tendency of coup. So it's not really surprising, but I feel like that shouldn't have happened. Yeah.
Well, still with you, Mr. Ogini, how far back do the mechanisms for peace in ECOWAS goes? There are those who will refer to the ECOWAS agreement updated in 1993 that includes principles previously absent, in the earlier pacts: solidarity and collective self-reliance, non-aggression between member states and the rest of them. But what is important here is exactly what is the origin of this series of coups, particularly the one in Niger being right above the north of Nigeria.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting conversation. If you look at ECOWAS, ECOWAS was formed basically for economic interest, and it transformed much more later, to encompass governance and security. And I could remember vividly, maybe in the last decade, ECOWAS is commended for this sort of gentleman agreement or two-term, but this gradually escalated. Maybe I could say it decreased in terms of how institutions, capture this aspect of free and fair election, and this also affects, for instance, how ECOWAS take action on if a president or a leader want to extend his tenure, what action ECOWAS take at that time, if it is affirmative, if it's pragmatic, or it's just more or less partnership. So this has effect on how this, grow to a greater extent. So with respect to Niger, as you know, Niger has had successful folk coup in the past, and the current president that was, head hostage. I mean, if you look at the situation with him, even before the inauguration, over 24 or 28 hours, it was there was an attempted coup d'etat. So this is an indication, that the conflict, Niger in particular, from the Mali side, from Burkina Faso side, from the Algeria side, and now from Nigeria side. So Niger has a series of external challenges at its border, and now within its border, there are also internal struggles. It's not just only this struggle enable military to gain more power, and then there is increase in militarization, which gives military a kind of strength, and then democratic institution is always played down in this case. So it's very easy for coup to take place.
Well,
Nigeria without exception.
Very, very. Anyway, let me ask you, Dr. Akinola. Looking at that, the map of Africa now. I mean, I'm sure you have seen that map that is going around now. And on the left and on the right side of Niger, and all across the belt, from one end of Africa to the other, along the same line as Niger, every country there, is now occupied by one military junta or the other. So there are those who are wondering whether or not there is not some chess player, at work. What do you think?
Thank you so much. I think we have to take a step back and look at the what I call the destabilization of Libya and the proliferation of not just arms and ammunition downward, but also the proliferations of fighters that have lost out in Libya coming into the Sahel. So we know that the entire Sahel region, from even the west up to the east, have been destabilized. And when you have insecurity, there cannot be development. We know the two of them are intertwined. So is that one is dependent on the other. In an environment of conflict, it's exceedingly difficult to have development. It's exceedingly difficult to have what they term as good governance because of the vulnerability and the militarization of the society. So it is not just about what is actually happening within the Sahel. These are also related to what is happening outside of the Sahel, and particularly at this point in time with the Russia-Ukraine war and this possibility or this maybe pessimism that the Cold War politics will be enacted once again and being played out in Africa, where we have the Western powers and the Eastern, I call them Eastern powers, including Russia, China, trying to balance their hegemony claim on Africa. So the conflict goes beyond that. We have seen the Wagner group being sponsored by Russia, particularly jubilating and even trying to frame the coup as an anti-colonial, as anti-colonialism, and trying to say we can offer our support. So there are all kinds of external play. We also know in the Sahel, Mali, all the countries that have military regimes are trying to chase out the West, France and Western powers from their territorial integrity, and that's why France have moved into Niger. So if Niger also successfully chased out France and the West, then we have that region possibly moving closer to the West, closer to countries like Russia, like China, and this is particularly worrying for counter-terrorism in West Africa and the Sahel.
Dr. Akinola, doesn't that in a way indict the African Union or the heads of state of these nations? You are not unaware that there's been more than one Russia-Africa summit, Russia-Germany summit, America-Africa summit, big about Russia-Africa summit, Germany-Africa summit, US-Africa summit, UK-Africa summit, all of them pretty much paying attention to the continent of Africa. Now, it would seem like it's even more difficult for African leaders themselves to come together and agree on a thing or two. So isn't that an indictment on its own where African leaders, whether military or civilian, have to look outside of their continent as opposed to stay within their continent and champion the cause of the continent?
Thank you. And that's the issues many of us have raised at the continental level within the space that civil society organizations have been given to operate. This has been exceedingly different from the Organization of African Unity that tried to mobilize members to have this non-aligned movement. You remember during the Cold War, as much as the West and Soviet Union at that time tried to polarize Africa, Africa were able to stand in unity to say we are not joining any of the polars, not any of the Western or Eastern Bloc. But that's not what we have under the African Union Peace and Security Architecture developmental templates, whereby the African Union believes, maybe under this ideology of African Renaissance, that they could develop and secure Africa by partnering with global powers. You know that the fund for the African Peace and Security Architecture is being how do I say, it's being sponsored by the European Union in the first instance. So that shows how dependent the African Union has been on Western powers. But you may not also blame the African Union because some of the times the member states also consistently refuse to pay their annual dues to the African Union. So where will they get the required resources to secure Africa? So there are all kinds of complexity, and Africa is presently divided because it looks as if the West has failed many African states, and they are turning to Russia, they are turning to China. Democracy, the particularly representative democracy, seems to have failed many of the African countries. So Why would they still stick to the West? And that's why you are saying in the Sahel that they are trying to turn away from the West to Russia, to China, to Turkey, and other countries. And it seems African Union are particularly somehow powerless in stopping these waves and romance towards Russia and other countries, because they are also romancing with some of those countries.
Well, Mr. Bayo Oluwake has since joined this conversation this morning. He is a global affairs analyst. He's also director and principal research fellow at the African Resource Development Center. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Mr. Oluwake. We're trying to get a background, first of all, into this conversation about how we got here. And the two guests, Dr. Akinola and Mr. Ogini, been trying to look at the background in perspective of how Western powers and European powers have attempted over the years to pretty much hold on to the reins of influence on Africa or these African countries, as opposed to the African countries themselves owning themselves and releasing themselves from these clutches. What's your take on that one and its influence or impact in the unrest in the Sahel?
That's a double-barrel question, but thank you for having me, and good morning to the viewers and other panelists. I hold a slightly different view, and my view is that depending on what is at stake, you may have a unanimity of interests. And I can easily give you an example with the peace and security architecture. Now, the orientation of the African Union and for African integration that is being implemented at the moment is founded specifically on what we call the regional economic communities. So in West Africa, you have ECOWAS. In East Africa, you have East African Community, you have SADC, Southern African Development Community in Southern Africa, and so on. And it is a regional economic blocks that are supposed to work more for integration of their sub-regions, and then we will collapse backwards into the AU at some future date. The AU currently only acts as an overarching, guiding mechanism. And that's why you find, for example, that in conflict resolution, based on the success of the ECOWAS model in the 90s, regional standby brigades were adopted. And so the regional bodies are expected to deal with these issues of breakdown of maybe democratic rule, or other terrorism and other things. And that's why you find that this is exactly what has been happening. So I would say that it is not exactly the AU, although the AU is supposed to provide guidance and that overarching supervision in quotes, if you like. And secondly, if you look at what has been done in the past, take ECOWAS, for instance. ECOWAS has been able to actually intervene in many countries successfully. In addition to Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 90s, we had Cote d'Ivoire when President Laurent Gbagbo lost an election and refused to leave. ECOWAS deployed what is called ECOMISI, and they were able to reinstate Mr. Alassane Ouattara, who won. I don't want to take too much time. Guinea-Bissau was another example. Gambia is another example. And I do not think that Western powers influenced ECOWAS into that. This has been part of what ECOWAS itself adopted as a means of ensuring that the continent, based on the AU's own position, that the continent should be more democratic. So I just thought that we need to keep that in perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that foreign interests don't get involved in African affairs. Of course they do. But all I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't put everything at the doorstep of foreign interference, or to suggest that Africans have been unable to take decisions. There are 54 countries on the continent, and out of these 54 countries, a majority of them, are not usually led one way or the other by foreign powers. Now, I think as well that we got where we are now, and I will summarize because of time, simply for three reasons in my view, and these are not exhaustive. Number one, we had the coronavirus pandemic, which devastated the global economy and also especially impacted the economy of developing countries. Secondly, we had the security vacuum in Libya, and I've said this elsewhere, when the North Atlantic Treaty Organization intervened to remove Colonel Gaddafi. Incidentally, the African leaders were about solving that problem. But from what we have heard President Museveni say, they were prevented from doing that by NATO, which went ahead to remove Gaddafi. And the security vacuum created there led Tuareg fighters who had been integrated into the Libyan army to move across the desert back to Mali, declare the Republic of Azawad, and create a significant destabilizing factor in the Sahel. Now, African countries mobilized to support the regime of Captain Sanogo to confront that. And the Tuaregs gave up fighting. Many of them gave up, but the jihadi insurgents filled that space, and then we have the problem we have today. So I think that it's maybe 50-50. We've had the AU or ECOWAS doing what it should do, although in the case of Niger, I am one of those who do not support the military intervention. I think it is going to be extremely counterproductive. But nonetheless, I think this is, what has gotten us to where we are. Perhaps with the exception of Guinea, where President Alpha Conde, gave himself the third term, and the military overthrew him. So roughly, I think this is the scenario and how we got to where we are now.
Let's talk about, how this concerns Nigeria directly or indirectly. We are not unaware, let me begin with you, Dr. Akela. We are not unaware of the response of Nigeria so far in what is happening in the region in a good number of ways. Quick back up to one of the conversations had in Abuja about this issue, where one of the leaders of Africa, I think, was talking about the influence or impact of governance, or a lack of it, the impact of governance on the people, or a lack of governance on the people, which could be responsible for these things. The leader was pretty much saying his fellow leaders were playing the giraffe and the issues that are going on. How significant, Dr. Akela, is governance in the unrest that we are witnessing in the sub-region right now?
Thank you. And that was the point I earlier made, that there is a convergence or maybe a strong nexus between development, insecurity, and governance. All of these are interlinked together. And I've said it, that when you have poverty, particularly as we have seen in the Sahel, in Niger, for instance, almost 46% of Nigerians lived on less than $1 per day. And this is a country that is rich in uranium. I do not want to speak about Nigeria because it is obvious our poverty is exceedingly endemic. So it's not just about Nigeria, not about Niger, across the Sahel country. And when you have poverty and people are actually fighting against the war of the belly because of poverty, food insecurity, climate change that has driven people from being economically productive, then those people, particularly an environment where you have high population of the youth that are restless, that are unemployed, that are hopeless, then insecurity will actually permeate such society, because you have some mischievous warlords that will be able to easily mobilize people to support whatever agenda they have. So at the heart of this crisis is the issue of misgovernance, or what we can call ineffective governance or poor governance. Of course, we can speak about global influence in the Sahel, what have we, but we also have to recognize the fact that despite the AIDS that is tripping into the Sahel, a country like Niger particularly rely on donor organization for survival. But despite these billions coming into the space, the average man on the street is still particularly poor. And when you have that, they have been under civilian administration for years and they did not fare better. So for them, it's not about the system of government, it is about improvement in their own economic situation. That's why we have seen celebrations across the Sahel welcoming military coup. So issue of governance, underdevelopment, or you can call it undevelopment, is particularly part of the motivation that emboldens the military to take power, because they know that they might be legitimate.
Mr. Ogini, on the same question, but take the perspective of the young people, the population of youths in the Sahel, more specifically Niger, whether or not government has done anything significant or at all to buy their confidence enough to support whatever initiatives they are coming up with. Youth engagement, how severe is it in this whole melee?
Thank you very much. I think, with respect to youth, I don't want to just isolate it. I first want to speak to what Akinola said. Niger has not experienced democratic transition successfully in the past years. So, I want us to know that Niger is a very strategic country when it comes to migration of Africa to Libya. Very strategic. And that's one of the reasons why international community has been very supportive in order to help people not to go through that route. That's the first thing. And young people are particularly are the people who move from this route to Libya now. So this is one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is the current president, which is head hostage. You know that is from minority group and an Arab. So, and before the election, you definitely know this ethnicity play a very key role into the election and still continue to generate a reaction from different ethnic groups. Third, you know that there's a Traore which has been fighting for autonomy, political autonomy since 1990, between 1991 and 1997. And this group posed a very serious security challenge in the northwestern region of Niger. So the third aspect is the resources, how the youth also are able to benefit from the resources that the state has. So these all together play a very important role on how this happen. But I will say that even the effect of Nigeria effects on Niger Republic is quite enormous. When the first subsidy removal took place, there was a protest in the state capital. So a lot of things went up, and this also was fed directly by Nigerians. So this play out on how this supports to bring in the flag of Russia, and but I must say that it's not only Russia, because I was in the border in the past 3 days, Niger border. So I saw also young people flagging even France border, even within Nigeria. So it depends on which way the media cover. So this dynamic is how the youth reflect on their future. So I think it's important to reflect that in this the whole evolution of crisis in Nigeria.
Mr. Oluwake, speak to this particular question, but from the perspective of the dramatis personae in governments, the politicians, policy makers, policy executors, and all of that. We saw a video, rightly or wrongly, saying that a particular government official was dragged in his own community in that same country, Niger. So speak to us on what you think has been the role, rightly or wrongly, of politicians in the belt, that is right now being occupied by military leaders all across the Sahel, the way we have it. What was left undone? And then we can now go to the international dimension, the diplomatic dimensions. But first of all, within these localities, how have we fared as Africans, particularly as leaders in those governments?
Thank you. I think, first of all, I agree with all the points made by other two speakers on the effects of poor governance. To your question specifically, if we go back in history, we would see that these countries, what we call this now being referred to as the belt, the Sahelian belt, so to speak, Virtually all of them are either almost entirely covered by the desert, or they are significantly exposed to what you might call today global warming, climatic changes, extremely adverse climatic changes. Niger is 80% desert. Mali is 65% desert. The entire northern Burkina Faso in the dry season is very, very dry, but in the rainy season, it gets some light. So that also imposes challenges economically on those countries. Added to that is the fact that the political elite of Francophone countries are quite different from the political elite of the Anglophone countries in one respect, which was that the French colonial policy, which every secondary school person in Nigeria who does government is taught, the policy of assimilation, where once you were a graduate, you were assimilated into French culture, you got a French passport. So you had all this first generation of leaders in Francophone Africa being French citizens, and therefore they could not oppose France. And you know all the other economic impediments that France imposed on them, including holding their foreign reserves, which of necessity must be in French banks. So all of these would, for you, produce a political elite that would significantly be focused on France. You know, colonialism itself was very long, so it's, even if you're not focused on your metropolitan colonizing power, it will still take you several decades to break yourself free from that.
Oh, pardon me, Mr. Luake, if I can butt in. Something you said earlier lines up in a way with what you just said now about, you know, the role that the politicians have played so far. You talked about the expanse of desert lands in these areas. How much different are they from Dubai? You know the progress that Dubai has made over the past few decades, even in the 80s. For God's sake, what was Dubai like compared to what it is now? Or what it was even like 10, 15, 20 years ago, when you know, the revolution of the entire nation had begun really, really vast. So one wonders, with all of the richness that Niger and other countries have under their lands, how difficult would it have been for them to foresee the challenges of you know, desertification that you're saying and get ahead of it?
I just said that the orientation of the leadership. You had a leadership which has been prepared, believing they were French citizens. Look, the current president of Guinea, Colonel Doumbouya, is a French citizen. He's a colonel in the Guinean army, but he's also a French citizen. He was in the French Legionnaires, even though he staged a coup to remove President Alpha Condé. Okay, so the orientation is important. Secondly, I don't think, and I'm not defending bad governance, but I don't think these countries are as economically endowed as Dubai. But that is not an excuse. I'm just trying to say that the orientation is important. If you look at Ghana, Nigeria, and so, our leaders challenged the British. Only Sékou Touré of Guinea challenged the French, challenged President de Gaulle. So you cannot rule that out. Now, if we are now having a situation in which, because of poor governance, effect of COVID, security vacuum in Libya, which makes weapons and everything available, even to extra non-state actors, so to speak, it's going to make governance extremely difficult, and especially democratic governance.
Okay.
Because in democratic governance, you give everyone the chance. So I think that why not excusing the coups? There are so many factors that have played into the situation in which we have, and clearly there is the resource dimension.
Okay.
And it's not only France. You know, all countries of the world are interested in resources in Africa.
Okay.
So the African elite, I think, has not been able to navigate or develop a policy that will see them successfully navigating all these contentions that come from extra-continental powers.
All right, gentlemen, let's talk about the diplomatic intervention so far and your confidence. Mr. Luake, I'll begin with you. So far you've seen, you know, the Nigeria's intervention, the comments that have been made, diplomatic trips that have been made already, and the position of ECOWAS, or the options that are on the table. What are your thoughts about those steps that have been taken. There are those who are wondering, should we even be considering military action at this time? But then there are those who are wondering whether or not we've even explored at all, much less enough, diplomatic interventions. Mr. Loake, let's begin with you.
Thank you, and I'll try to be brief. In diplomacy, first of all, you will not give a deadline, even if you have a deadline in mind. If you take the NATO-Russia problem over Ukraine, the Russians are simply told, withdraw to the 2014 borders. NATO hasn't told Russia, you must withdraw by this date. Because when you give a specific deadline, you must have the resources to effect compliance. You must have really looked at all of that. And I think you must also have engaged with the other party, okay, had their side, and then arrive at your, measures and the deadline. So I think that maybe ECOWAS was hasty in imposing a deadline. Secondly, if there will be the deployment of military power, and I need to clarify this, and I'm not speaking for ECOWAS, but from reality and practice, deployment of military power does not necessarily mean you are going to start shooting. There's what you call psychological pressure. You can deploy your military around the area, to be like what was done to President Jammeh when he refused to hand over power. Not a single shot was fired, but forces were deployed, and there were maneuvers all around the place, But in the case of Niger, if we did that, it could escalate because the two sides are already taking hardline positions. Thirdly, and for me this is very critical, Nigeria may have to spearhead any kind of non-diplomatic, or anyway, it's diplomatic because even when you use the military, it is a continuation of policy by other means. But Nigeria may have to spearhead that. We are not in a position to do that. Niger, number one, has supported Nigeria during situations in the UN and the AU where we needed their vote. Niger has been a strong ally to fight Boko Haram. Niger is a buffer zone for Nigeria against jihadi insurgents from the northwest in Mali. Niger is a buffer zone for Nigeria against a collapsed Libya, reducing the effect of these two critical countries on our own security. Deploying the military into Niger, in my honest and humble opinion, may complicate the security situation, and I personally do not support it.
Thank you. Ms. Ogini?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I go in line with what Adebayo said, but maybe I will add to this that, Niger to Nigeria, even during the Civil War, the Niger president actually contributed to the negotiation. And in terms of resource sharing, as you can see now, we depend on Niger River for electricity. So they play a key role. And then when you now talk about people at the border communities, we have to reflect on how their life will look like. Currently, Nigeria has over 300,000 refugees in Niger. And that's very critical. We have to reflect on that. But on whether deadline or not deadline, I would say yes. There have been extended deadline over the years. With Mali, it has yielded no results. There have been extended deadline with Sudan for transition. It has yielded no result. And the same thing with Burkina Faso, it has yielded no result. So they are given a deadline that is very short, I think is pragmatic. Yeah, however, on the aspect of military intervention, it has to be well thought out. I know Nigeria is currently engaging through the ECOWAS, Libya, and Algeria in order to seek their opinion on this issue. So I'm sure that that will really matters a lot in terms of how the intervention could really be effective. So other than that, I will also say that when you look at the multinational joint task force, which has been fighting, insurgency in the last decade, Niger holds this the fourth sectoral region, which is a key region, for multinational task force. And I think the relationship between this military, the Lake Chad Basin Commission, the assistance of it in terms of the military cooperation will be affected, and we have to reflect on this.
Same issue, but if you can pay a little more attention to how it'll affect the people whatever the diplomatic intervention is, Dr. Akinola, it has to consider how it'll affect the people. Add to that the fact that at least 4 countries border Niger Republic. So how do you think these interventions, these diplomatic interventions so far will affect the people or are affecting the people already?
Thank you. And maybe I must start by also saying that I don't know what ECOWAS I don't know the information they have on their table that will make them even give ultimatum in the first place. I know that sometimes maybe it is something like a deterrent. Maybe they want to go back to the ECOMOG days. I'm not sure if they have the capacity to do that. But if we look at Mali, when ECOWAS imposed sanctions on Mali, I'm talking of economic sanctions, it's not the military that will suffer. It is the average man on the streets that will suffer. It is businesses that will suffer because the military, I'm sure, before you plan a coup, you must have gauged the cons and the pros. And they know that if we were to move in and remove the democratically elected government, there will be sanctions, and they must have been prepared to that. So imposing sanctions that they can't travel ban, they don't even want to travel. So that's ineffective. So we know that when sanctions are imposed, ordinary citizens will suffer. But it's slightly different from military engagement now. And we have to possibly divide this into two. It is different when you are invading a country for whatever reason. You are declaring a war on a country. It's different from when you are declaring a war on a government that the region considers illegitimate or illegal. Maybe I should use illegal. So that is different. A declaration by ECOWAS of war against the military regime is not a declaration of war against Nigeria and against the country as a whole. There is still a legitimate government headed by someone that is still in Niger. And what ECOWAS says that restore the legitimate president to power. So when they declare war on the military regime, it's not necessarily a declaration of war on it. We saw that in Gambia, like my colleague have said. We also saw that in the case of Gbagbo. If the majority are in opposition to any government, when an external power moving to remove that government, that is not a declaration of war against the country as a whole. And one thing we have seen in Mali is that the same reason that the Malian military regime gave for overthrowing the civilian regime, they are even worse off. There is more insecurity now in Mali. There's no any form of economic development in Mali under the military government, and maybe that's what ECOWAS are saying. But one thing I would want to say is that you start with soft power before you switch to hard power in diplomacy. ECOWAS have not done that. They ought to start with negotiating. If the military junta refuse to abdicate government, then they can now switch to, because we saw that with Gbagbo, they intervened, they sent presidents to Gbagbo, he refused to leave the office, then they move in, and in any case, how is this
don't you think that has happened, Dr. Akinola? I mean, I think that 2 delegations have already been sent to Niger.
No, that is not enough, because I know Abubakar that was sent did not even meet with the military head. I'm saying you have to exhaust every form of subtle diplomacy before you engage militarily. Because one thing I know, I don't want to be like NATO that will go into a country, remove the leader without any plan. If ECOWAS are to move into there, I'm not sure they have any plan. What if they remove it? So I'm just saying they ought to be more careful.
Okay. Well, let's close with this, gentlemen. 30 seconds each. Dr. Akinola, I'll start with you. How does this affect Nigeria directly? Niger is a major border country and has quite a number of states. And you and I know the poverty level, multidimensional poverty level in the north, particularly in those states where that border Niger directly. What should be the concern for Nigeria now, particularly at those states level?
I think it is particularly concerning, and I think Nigeria should be very interested in the political stability of Niger, and they should be wary of the engagement of foreign mercenaries into that space. Nigeria should be there, because if you look at the border, it's very long with Niger, and we don't want mercenary, particularly Russian mercenary, moving in and out of Niger and Nigeria. This will complicate the fight against Boko Haram. And if you see displacement from Niger coming into Nigeria, that would be exceedingly, it will put more pressure on the economic prosperity of that part of Nigeria.
All right. Mr. Ogini?
Yeah, I think Nigeria has to think about its national interest, especially with the Northeast now. Some parts have been cleared. Some of the parts that have been occupied by Boko Haram have been cleared, and peace is restoring to some of these areas. And there are other areas that are also not yet clear. So, and this also still depends largely on the collaboration in that Lake Chad basin. So we have to reflect on that and see how we can keep the stability in that region.
Mr. Oluwake.
ECOWAS is on the right path, except for the haste to deploy military action. In Nigeria's interest will not be served. For example, one, if we take actions that directly impact negatively on us, and this has been said on this program, I don't want to repeat. Secondly, ECOWAS has to be very careful not to be perceived as an instrument of France or as an instrument of the Euro-Atlantic powers. The credibility of ECOWAS is important. And then three, Nigeria, like my other co-panelists said, Nigeria must factor in her own national interest in this matter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bayo Oluwake, Global Affairs Analyst, Director and Principal Research Fellow at the African Resource Development Center. Thank you so much. Along with Mr. Dr. Adeoye Akinola, who is Head Research and Teaching and Head of Unit, African Union Studies Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, South Africa. We've also had Mr. Oyewole Ogini, Research and Analyst, Armed Conflicts, Peace and Security, Africa, Bonn International Conflict Center in Germany. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your thoughts and perspectives this morning.
Thank you.
All right. So that is that, and let's hope that everyone has gotten some understanding and hopefully some marching orders, if I dare say. We're back right after now to take on another conversation. Do stay with us.